Hello, welcome. My name is Beatrice McKenzie, and I'm an associate professor of history here at Beloit College. Several years ago, I attended a lecture by Beloit College alumna Elizabeth Katz Mooney, class of 1948, that changed my thinking about the project I was embarking on. Professor Mooney had worked as a research associate for the Kinsey Institute and for Planned Parenthood for many years, before she taught a very popular course at University of Indiana in South Bend, demurely titled Marital Relations and Sexuality. Who better to explain the cultural evolution of American women's sexuality than a woman who had herself come of age right at the end of World War II, studied the phenomenon at Kinsey Institute, and then turned her knowledge into lectures aimed at a part of the population at exactly the right age to hear them. I'd like to speak today about another woman of Mooney's generation, Allison Palmer, who worked for the US government as a Foreign Service officer beginning in the late 1950s. The title of my talk is The Sexual Revolution and Gender Discrimination in the 1960s and 70s US Foreign Service. Allison Palmer arrived at her position as vice consul at the US Embassy in Leopoldville, Congo in June 1960. Less than a month later, soldiers in the newly independent nation mutinied, acting in anti-colonial rage against the former colonizers and the global forces that sought to reinsert a Western-oriented power structure there. During that crisis, Palmer saved the lives of several young American men in the Congo. When her exploits were publicized in the international press, an accompanying photo displayed conflicting images. The photo was distinctly feminine, showing a young, pretty blonde. It was distinctly sexual, recalling pinup images of the 1940s. And it was distinctly revolutionary, showing Palmer in a beret. All three portrayals of Palmer played out in her Foreign Service career. Palmer's experiences in State Department provide an opportunity to examine the culture of the Foreign Service in a particular moment of change. In this paper, I draw on oral history, extensive court and archival records, newspaper, and State Department sources to examine women's status in the service in the 1960s and early 1970s. I argue that the sexualization of women officers in the 1960s led to less rather than more gender equality among Foreign Service officers. I also show, however, that Palmer's experiences in the Foreign Service defied gender norms and that her battles led to greater gender equity in the Foreign Service. Palmer's background was similar to the backgrounds of men recruited by State Department after World War II. Congress had mandated a more democratic service, and the department recruited officers with middle-class backgrounds. Although Palmer's immediate family struggled financially, they were nonetheless middle class. Palmer was born in Boston in 1931 to a mother whose family owned a newspaper and a father who wrote for the New York Times. She studied English literature at an Ivy League university on scholarship, at Pembroke College, the women's college in Brown University. When she graduated and got a job at the New York Times, however, it became evident to her that journalism as a career was not open to women, and so she jumped at the chance to take the Foreign Service exam. She did not pass the exam, but joined the Foreign Service as a secretary and was sent to her first African post, the Gold Coast, the British colony that would soon become the nation of Ghana. There she had the opportunity to see all facets of embassy jobs and decided that the political officer's job would be best if she could pass the exam because the job was most like being a foreign correspondent. As a secretary in Accra, she wrote her first political report about a Ghanaian woman who had hostile comments to make upon her return from a 2-month exchange visit to the US. She received 2 promotions in rapid succession in Ghana. When she took the Foreign Service exam again, she passed it. Sturdy bars existed to make the Corps seem more democratic while reserving nearly every junior officer position with a future for white men. White women had been recruited in the Foreign Service as an experiment in the 1920s, but only 2 of the first 6 women to enter the service survived the draconian policy that required a woman to resign if she married. 2 token women served full careers, and their success was cited for decades as evidence that the department did not discriminate against women. Meanwhile, the exam prevented women from entering the service by normal channels until 1947. No women passed the exam between 1929 and 47. And after that, very few women passed up through the 1960s. A personnel officer testified in 1971 that Palmer could not have passed the Foreign Service exam in 1955 because in the exam process, the service only accepted one woman or one black candidate each year, and the service had taken a black man in 1955. Some officers did enter without passing the exam. White men, officers of color, and white women came into the service out of the military or other government service through the Riston program. They filled low and mid-level consular and administrative positions with little upward movement during the remainder of their careers. The Riston program allowed elite officers a more direct path to the highest-ranking positions. By passing the exam, Palmer entered the service through the portal normally reserved for elite and middle-class white men. She might have been thought of as a promising consular officer. The token woman who had served a full career as a consular officer would retire in 1964. Palmer only became problematic for her peers when she exceeded expectations and sought a job as a political officer. Palmer's experiences in her first postings as a Foreign Service officer showed her to be on the fast track to professional success. In 1960, she was sent as consular officer to Leopoldville, later known as Kinshasa, in the newly independent Republic of the Congo. Within a month of her arrival, Congolese troops mutinied against continued Belgian control over their military forces. Violence and rioting escalated rapidly. During a period of time known as the Congo Crisis, Belgian interests sought to keep control of the copper and cobalt-rich province of Katanga, which declared independence from the Congo on July 11th. The US government was deeply concerned about possible Soviet influence in the Congo, the heart of Africa. From his first public speech at the independence festivities, when Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba reminded those present that Congolese independence was won by struggle and not by Belgian largesse, the West saw him as a foe and a possible communist. Lumumba called for United Nations involvement to quell unrest in the country, but the UN troops were not used in Katanga, and so Lumumba requested Soviet assistance. In September, Lumumba was overthrown and replaced with Western approval by the strongly anti-communist Joseph Mobutu. Throughout this period, acts of violence were perpetrated, especially upon Belgian civilians who fled the country en masse. Charged as a consular officer with protecting American lives and interests through this period of insurrection, Palmer refused the American ambassador's edict for all American women and children to leave the country. 2 episodes of Palmer's experiences in the Congo brought her a measure of fame in the public eye and in the department. En route to the airport, on official business one day, Palmer came across an embassy vehicle that had hit and killed a Congolese child and had overturned in the ditch. A large crowd had gathered around the occupants of the vehicle, 2 embassy employees, both young American men, and the embassy's middle-aged military attaché and his wife. The crowd was taking vengeance for the child's death on the 2 younger men, who had bravely stepped away from the couple to protect the military attaché's wife. The men were seriously injured. One of them had been stabbed in the chest and shoulder and was bleeding profusely. The other had been stabbed and was, when Palmer arrived, being hit repeatedly on the back of the neck with a machete. Palmer recognized the men as her colleagues. Acting in her official and protective capacity as U.S. consul, she drove her convertible into the crowd, pulled the more injured man into her car, and sped off. She had seen that another vehicle had followed her car into the crowd, and she hoped it had picked up the second man. Not knowing whether the man in her car would live or die, Palmer got her to medical care at the airport. She was credited with saving his life. The second man also survived the attack, but he never credited her with any act of bravery. That man was 30-year-old Frank Carlucci, who was a Foreign Service officer then, but who later became Deputy Director of the CIA and Secretary of Defense. Press and private accounts of the rescue made Palmer's gender a key part of the story. One article spoke of, quote, the day when political officer Frank Carlucci was saved from death only by the intervention of the pretty vice consul, Miss Allison Palmer. When she left Congo, the headline announcing her return read, "Tally, U.S. blonde in Congo, coming home as heroine." Later, an American wrote Palmer in a letter of support, quote, "We remember so vividly your coolness and courage when you saved the lives of two of your colleagues on the road from Kinshasa out to the airport. You were magnificent." Carlucci has never recognized her role that day. And technically speaking, he was not rescued by her. He got himself into the vehicle that followed Palmer's into the crowd that day. The State Department maintained gender expectations when it awarded Carlucci, not Palmer, with an individual award for his, quote, constant display of outstanding courage in the face of real danger. The next day, Palmer saved the lives of 3 journalists, 2 Americans and a Brit, earning their gratitude and awe and more publicity. As Palmer described it, she was en route with the Canadian Consul General to his house for a drink after work when gunfire erupted. They swung by the Ghanaian consul's house, where a tense standoff was playing out between the Ghanaian and UN and Congolese troops. The diplomat had been declared persona non grata due to over-involvement in Congolese politics. The Congolese government had sent the military to arrest and deport him. To protect him, UN troops surrounded the diplomat's house. Palmer and Wood went around the house, and from across a hedge, Palmer saw her 3 friends, journalists trying to cover the story, sitting in a prostrate position in front of a group of Congolese soldiers who seemed ready to execute them. Acting again in her capacity as U.S. vice consul and hoping to disrupt the situation, Palmer called out, "Hi there," to her friends, then strode into the middle of the group and stated her intent to protect the Americans. One of the journalists said later, "She was unbelievable. The soldiers were so stunned at the nerve of this girl, they just sort of faded away." Newspaper stories that described the incidents accentuated the gendered aspects of the story, mentioning her blonde ponytail and her size. She was 5 feet tall. Press accounts of the pint-sized heroine even played into the American public's hopes for the effectiveness of U.S. foreign policy in newly independent African nations. One account said, quote, "This pert and bouncy blonde is about the most attractive and cheerful fixture of the Congo's first 2 chaotic years of independence." But the accounts also played into ongoing Cold War anxieties about U.S. foreign policy generally, and specific concerns about the masculinity of U.S. diplomats. Congress had accused the service of elitism for years, but diplomats came under special scrutiny in the 1950s when Senator Joseph McCarthy, among others, charged that the institution attracted effeminate men and sexual deviants. The organization reacted by becoming more democratic, by recruiting white middle-class ex-naval officers like Frank Carlucci, but also by reducing the already small number of women it recruited. Women made up only 7% of FSOs in 1965. By 1970, their number dropped in half. Palmer's success and potential as what was referred to as a substantive officer was rewarded by an assignment to advanced area studies in African politics, economics, and sociology at Boston University. Selection for advanced training was reserved for political or economic officers whose careers showed potential at mid-ranking and senior levels. Only 4 women were selected for advanced training between 1967 and 1970. In the same period, 338 men were assigned to advanced language and area studies. Now Palmer would be changing functions from consular work to what was then called substantive work as a political officer. Here she would join the ranks of the most capable and ambitious officers who would compete among themselves in assignments leading up to career ambassador. A year later, however, her studies completed, 3 ambassadors refused to hire her as a political officer in African capitals. She finally negotiated her way into an assignment in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, where she served from 1966 to 68. But the American ambassador there, Edward Corey, required her to act as his staff aide for the remainder of his assignment there. Palmer reported she was used as the ambassador's wife's social secretary, writing out invitations to the ambassador's 4th of July and Christmas parties. After Corey left the post, she had a second, highly successful year as a political officer in Addis, after which she was again promoted. Now she was one of the highest performing junior officers in the service. Feeling stung about the year she had wasted trying to get an assignment in Africa, however, Palmer chose for her next assignment to work for USAID, a branch of State Department in Vietnam. She served there from 1968 to 70. State Department records show a new emphasis on female officers' sexuality in the 1960s. The department sought special information about women officers from the psychiatric part of the medical exam. On a national level, all US states permitted use of contraception by 1965, and the Supreme Court ruled that states could not interfere with a woman's right to choose an abortion early in pregnancy in 1973. Newly recruited women in the Foreign Service in the 1960s and 70s answered questions about their sexual history in their medical exams without understanding that the information would not be kept private. If an unmarried woman, and remember they were all unmarried until 1971, if an unmarried woman disclosed that she had had an abortion or was using birth control pills, the doctor would inform security, which understood these facts to be, quote, indications of immoral conduct. It became part of their permanent record and affected their security clearance. In the era of the sexual revolution, State Department guarded the chastity of its female officers, who were still required to remain single throughout their careers. Allison Palmer's personnel files show that her sexuality was commented on in periodic reviews. Alongside real praise for Palmer's skills as a political officer, her facility for getting along with non-Americans, for example, was outstanding. Her superior officers commented on her figure. In her performance evaluation in 1967, for example, the head of the political section wrote, quote, "Ms. Palmer is well-proportioned and counts primarily on nature rather than on science to portray her to the world." He added, "She's attractive and somewhat shorter than average." The comments became more personal when the officer said Palmer, quote, "enjoys the company of men and indeed prefers it," although he was careful to state that she was, quote, "popular with her own sex as well," and assured the reader that, quote, "her conduct is at all times exemplary." In a bureaucracy in which a woman's sexuality could be viewed as a security threat, being explicit about a woman officer's behavior in the company of men was of critical importance. As exemplary as her behavior was, Palmer's heroism in her posting in the Congo, so widely publicized in and outside of the State Department, helped mark her as what Ricky Solinger calls a sexual revolutionary. The phrase is more inflammatory than Palmer's record suggests, but as Solinger defines it, the sexual revolution referred mainly to white women's sexuality. By 1965, white women were, if sexually active and outside the control of men, sexual revolutionaries, no longer seen as vulnerable and in need of protection, but seen as, quote, aggressors against a vulnerable society. Palmer's rapid rise slowed considerably when she filed a discrimination suit based on what happened to her in the mid-60s, Foreign Service. She became effectively a gender and sex revolutionary in the department. Testimony in the discrimination hearing revealed that two of the ambassadors who had refused her assignments to their staffs had concerns about her sexual safety based on American racialized understandings of African men. The concern was that Palmer might meet foreigners, African men, who could be, quote, sexually dangerous. The U.S. ambassador to Uganda testified that the officer assigned to labor reporting in Kampala was, quote, always a young, male junior officer. The labor movement in Uganda was young, inexperienced, volatile, and all male. It would have been impossible, in my opinion, for a young woman officer to establish the effective relationships necessary, unquote. The U.S. ambassador to Ethiopia, Ambassador Corey, was quoted in the press as saying, quote, "The savages in the Ethiopian labor movement would not be receptive to Miss Palmer, except for her natural endowments." The Washington Post quoted him to say African men were, quote, wolves. Always indignant about Palmer's case, Corey also revealed the extent to which the categories of female and black Foreign Service officers were seen in competition with each other to displace deserving white male officers. Palmer's grievance stated that when she was assigned as a political officer to Addis Ababa, the ambassador moved his special assistant to the political section and moved her into his position. In his testimony, the ambassador said Palmer had neglected to mention that the officer in question, Jack Gloucester, was, quote, a black, and that, quote, his promotion, only at her temporary inconvenience, achieved a breakthrough against discrimination of far greater import than in her own case, imagined or real. As Corey said in 1966, quote, once you begin to make distinctions as to what females can or cannot do in the service, the fundamental principle of equality falls apart and is, unconsciously or consciously, an excuse for confirming or stirring other prejudices. Palmer faced those prejudices too. Although the ambassador's assumptions were that a blonde, girl-next-door type like Allison Palmer would face sexual threats in the new era of African independence and Black power, Palmer's own accounts suggest differently. In 6 years in Africa, Palmer said she never faced a sexual threat from an African. She did face harassment and threats, however, from Americans. An FSO who was angry at her for asking him not to use the phone on her desk retaliated by leaving pornography on her desk. Palmer fought off explicit physical sexual advances from a married colleague in the Congo. Sometimes she was protected from advances, such as when her boss warned her not to be alone with the appropriately named roving American medical officer in the Congo who made a practice of hitting on single women. That protection was not fail-safe, however. When I interviewed Palmer summer before last, she was still furious when she told me that her boss in Ghana had fixed her up with his friend who turned out to be married. This final example allows us to see the gap between what Palmer and her superior officer expected. She believed her friends and colleagues would see her as a woman who respected the moral and religious boundaries of marriage, whereas her superior officer saw her as a single woman whose choices in the changing mores of the sexual revolution may have involved dating married men. Palmer's rapid rise slowed considerably after she filed the gender discrimination complaint, for this action marked her even more clearly as a gender and sex revolutionary. She now assumed this role in the department, and evidence suggests her militants pushed the department to seek, quote, more sensible, honest, legitimate women to work with, unquote. Palmer won her discrimination case in 1971, but she appealed it for a ruling that would give her a promotion retroactively and back pay. When she won that pay, she used the $25,000 to initiate a class action lawsuit with several other female Foreign Service officers that was only finally settled in 2010. As a result of Palmer's actions, women gained in status in the Foreign Service. The requirement to resign upon marriage was dropped in 1971. Although ambassadors could still manipulate assignments after 1975, no position was allowed to be closed to women officers. Women saw greater success in assignments as political and economic officers, in assignments to advanced language studies and area studies, and in promotions to the senior Foreign Service. Allison Palmer is a significant historical figure. She exhibited impressive talents as a Foreign Service officer. She also fought marginalization and stigmatization of gender discrimination in a powerful bureaucracy for decades. She won impressive reforms for women directly via court settlements and judges' orders, and she served as a revolutionary figure against whom other women reformers' views and actions seemed more acceptable. Palmer's experiences in the 1960s allow us to see how sexuality played into the structural bars that women faced in the service. Her gender equity complaint against the State Department exposed the State Department hierarchy's anxieties about challenges to white male authority and joined preoccupations with masculinity in the Cold War diplomatic service. Concerns about female officers' sexuality led to more, not less, gender discrimination against women in the 1960s and 70s. Thank you for your attention. I welcome your comments and questions.
Beatrice, I think you said that for nearly 20 years, not a single woman passed this Foreign Service exam. So it makes me wonder, what's on the exam? What's the content and what's necessary to pass?
Well, I mean, I think you should reverse your thinking about the exam. It wasn't that the content was so difficult for women to pass. It was the idea of the Foreign Service officers who were evaluating each candidate, whether or not they had passed or not. It was the idea that women could not pass the Foreign Service exam that kept them from passing. So the exam questions could change according to the panel's evaluation of the person in front of them.
Beatrice, now it makes sense why the university in Moscow is called after Patrice Lumumba. I never knew why we chose just one of all African men that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that other professors on this campus could answer that more fully, but he was one of the first allies that the Soviet Union had in Africa.
What do we know about comparable discrimination in other government agencies in this period? Is it particularly a problem in the Foreign Service because they're sending people abroad? Or are there similar battles being fought? Or is that not something you've looked at?
There are similar battles being fought in other organizations, and somewhat ironically, State Department claimed that it was the most equitable of the executive branch organizations. And that was because they counted in the Foreign Service specialists and secretaries, which increased their number of women, especially over time. But women fought in the Foreign Trade Service. I think I saw recently that 2 women served full careers in the Trade Service, and then there were no women after 1937. So in that service, which was then merged with the Foreign Service, there was the same kind of non-acceptance of women.
Beatrice, could you talk a little bit about the situation today in the State Department with women in the Foreign Service?
Sure. It's always, as a historian, it's always difficult to choose the time that you end your study, right? And so I can speak about sort of moments over the last several years that I've noticed change in the Foreign Service. But I should start off by saying that Allison Palmer believes very little change has occurred. She gets the State Department monthly report and she follows, State Department, over time, and she distrusts the senior Foreign Service, which she believes is still completely unrepresentative of women. From my looking at the numbers, when I started the project in 2010, I thought it was ironic that in the previous 15 years, 12 of the previous 15 years, a woman had been Secretary of State, and that you could see that someone was watching the numbers quite closely at the top. So the undersecretaries of state, I think there were 8, and there were 4 men and 4 women. But beneath that, the deputy chiefs of mission to all of the group of 20 were men, except I think there was 1 woman in 2010 in Italy. However, between 2010 and now, there has been a lot of change, and I wonder whether Secretary Clinton or someone else looked specifically at those kinds of numbers that I was looking at. I don't think it's from my interest in it at all, but I think someone else looked and said, wait a minute, even though we've got this equity here at the top, we need to look beneath the very top and see what the senior Foreign Service looks like. So I think there is progress being made by women. I don't have the exact numbers of the overall senior Foreign Service, but I think there is progress being made, sure. And as far as passing the exam, I think I saw online that in 2006, there was finally sort of 50-50. 50% of those who passed were women and 50% were men.
So you talked about the discrimination that both African Americans and women faced in the State Department, in the diplomatic service. So I was wondering, are there any comparable cases of African American women who tried to make it in the Foreign Service, or when was the first time that they actually found a way into the higher positions?
I haven't studied African American women specifically, but I also recall that one of the first to pass the exam was in the 1960s, possibly 1966. And as part of my larger project, I've recently interviewed an African American woman who's not quite retired from the Foreign Service to see what her experiences were over the period, 1980s to present. So I envision using that material more after she retires.
Beatrice, you mentioned that you interviewed Allison Palmer. Could you talk about the interview, how it went?
Oh, sure. Yeah. She's a delightful person in her 80s. She invited me to her home. She lives on Cape Cod, and I spent a couple of days there and interviewed her over the course of maybe 2 or 3 days. Then I also went back last summer, so I've been there 2 summers, to sort of do follow-up and read more. She's a person who saves all of everything that refers to her, and there's quite a lot with all of these court cases. So I have been back to visit. She's very warm and kind and intelligent, incredibly intelligent woman who is not bitter towards Foreign Service. She is careful toward Foreign Service and any other organization or person that she grows not to trust. She's also an ordained Episcopalian minister, and she was one of the first women ordained. And so she's got, I'm only looking at sort of this half of her biography. She's got this other half that's just as rich about being ordained a minister and the sorts of institutional barriers that she faced in that struggle. So, delightful person to interact with. I also taught a course last semester here at Beloit College and Skyped her in after the section of the course where we talked about her gender equity case. And she was fantastic. It was interesting because almost immediately the questions turned from further questions about her life to advice about what seniors should do when they leave Beloit College. And her training as a minister really showed. She was very kind and very direct and honest with them. And she, so one student asked, I think, Andy was there. One student asked, said, "Oh my God, I'm terrified. I'm about a senior and I'm terrified." And she said, "We all face that fear. Some of us don't admit it, but we all face it." And that, what a perfect thing to say to a 22-year-old graduating senior who has, a lot of potential. So. Well, again, I want to thank you all for coming. And if you have any questions, I'll be here for a few minutes after. Thank you.